Okay, we are on Pontius Pilate, chapter 19. Drained by the events of that morning, Pilate reclined alone for lunch. Procula sent word that she would not join him until dinner because of her indisposition. He drank more wine than usual since he would not be holding court that afternoon. He drank also to dull the immediate memory of the morning's ordeal. Governing Judea was a corrosive experience, Pilate decided. One day soon he might follow Gratus's example and ask to be relieved of the prefecture and transferred elsewhere, hopefully back to Rome. Almost 7 years had passed since he'd been there. Too long, too terribly long. 7 years of confrontation with the Jews. Could anyone really govern them successfully, except Jews themselves? Perhaps that was the real reason for their agitation. They felt that only they could rule themselves, though even that was debatable, considering their intense inner rivalries. 2 Jews, 3's opinion, went the aphorism, and Pilate thought it sober truth. After lunch and a fitful nap, he called for his afternoon bath earlier than usual. He took it outside in the garden pool just off the inner courtyard. While splashing about in the crystal blue waters of Herod's lavish natorium, Pilate continued his musing. How would Herod the Great have judged the case this morning? He certainly wouldn't have shied away from it like his son Antipas. Pilate grinned. No, Jesus would never even have come to trial. Very quietly, very efficiently, Herod would have had him assassinated, since he dreaded anyone using the term king, like the time those sages came to Jerusalem asking about a newborn king of the Jews. Now there's a coincidence, Pilate startled. A baby and a man I just condemned to death, both called king of the Jews. Herod killed the baby, I the man. Does that make me as bad as Herod? No, I was forced into it. I wonder how he's doing out there, Jesus of Nazareth, king of the Jews. Probably silent, determined, resigned as ever. Why didn't he make a defense? Why was he so uncooperative, or too cooperative for his own conviction? I had to act not only as judge, but as his defense attorney, too. I wonder if Procula knows. Have nothing to do with that innocent man, she wrote. She'll think I spurned her note, of course. That innocent man. Where have I heard that before? Yes, I was reading it in Plato. Pilate pulled himself out of the water and walked over to a chair where he had left a scroll of the Republic, which was written by Plato. Turning back a few sections, he found the passage. The innocent man will be scourged, tortured, bound, blinded with fire, and finally, after enduring every extremity of suffering, he will be impaled on the cross. A strange coincidence, he thought to himself, and how curious of Plato, writing against the background of Socrates' martyrdom, to use the figure of the cross when Socrates had quietly sipped his hemlock. He drove back into the pool and swam its length, then turned over to float. By this time, he noticed something distinctly uncanny was happening. Shortly after lunch, the sun had started to dim from some kind of overcast, and the sky was now a dreadfully glowering purple. Pilate thought a severe thunderstorm was brewing, but there was no wind, no lightning, no approaching rumbles. He slipped out of the pool, dressed, and climbed to an upper turret of the palace. The sky was blackening more deeply, yet no rain fell. He was startled to see that the entire countryside was darkened. No patch of brighter blue showed anywhere on the horizon. He could barely see across Jerusalem to the cluster of people gathered at Golgotha around the silhouette of the 3 crosses. Was it a solar eclipse? In the city below, oil lamps were flickering at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Suddenly, Pilate seemed to hear and feel it at the same time. A tremor shook Jerusalem, and then a moderately severe earthquake filled the air with grinding and buckling, tearing and clatter. Down on the esplanade, he watched a fissure yawn open, which seemed to run eastward across the city to the Temple Mount. Foundations near this crevice were ripped apart, and there were screams from the city. The arches of his aqueduct parted and crumbled into the Hinnom Valley. Water cascaded from the ruptured trough. Summoning his palace guard, he dispatched them through Jerusalem to report on the damage. Then he ordered the Antonia cohort out of the barracks to patrol the city and maintain order. His engineers were to take a construction detail out to the aqueduct and make emergency repairs. It was all very weird. First the mysterious darkness, then the earthquake. But the crisis seemed to pass, as quickly as it had come. The sun in a normally bright sky burst upon Jerusalem, and in minutes the heavens resumed their regular blue, the strangest celestial phenomenon Pilate had ever witnessed. He was just rearranging his nerves when an aide reported that the high priest's servant requested a moment of his time. Oh, will they never leave me in peace? Pilate fretted. Let him in. Yes, Malchus. Excellency, he bowed. Since the most solemn Sabbath in the Jewish year begins at sundown, my lord Caiaphas and the priests request that toward the end of the day You permit the legs of the crucified prisoners to be broken, so that they will die and can be buried. Then their bodies will not be left hanging on the crosses to desecrate the Sabbath." Pilate dashed off a note authorizing the centurion at Golgotha to do as the priest requested, and he gave it to Malchus. Breaking the legs of those who were crucified hastened death by suffocation, since the diaphragm and ribcage were severely pressured by being hung from the arms above, rather than resting on the normal support provided by the legs. Late in the afternoon, a member of the Sanhedrin requested an audience with the governor. His patience ebbing, Pilate was about to roast the caller when he saw that this one had never bothered him before. "Didn't I meet you some years ago in Caesarea, counselor?" he inquired. "Yes, Excellency, I am Joseph of Arimathea. I'll take only a moment of your time. My colleague Nicodemus and I seek your permission to bury the body of Jesus of Nazareth. I have a sepulchre rather close to Golgotha." "Jesus is already dead?" Pilate asked. "Yes," said Joseph, lowering his eyes, for he did not want to betray emotion in front of the prefect. "When did he die?" Pilate asked. "Shortly after the 9th hour, at the time of the earthquake." "Men don't die on the cross that quickly." If you will pardon, Excellency, very little about this crucifixion was normal." "True, but after the great rebellion under Spartacus, it took days, not hours, for his men to die on their crosses along the Appian Way. Are the other two still alive?" "They were when I left," Joseph said. "Did Jesus say anything before he died?" "Yes, something quite loudly, which surprised us since we thought he was unconscious." "It is accomplished," he said. "Father, into thy hands I commit thy spirit." And with that he died. Joseph looked down for a moment, then resumed. "The bystanders were already frightened by the intense darkness, but when the earth shook, they ran back into the city, terrified. Even your centurion was struck by it. He looked up at the body of Jesus and said, 'Truly this man was the Son of God.'" Brushing his hand slowly across his brow, Pilate asked, "Was he, counselor? Was he a son of God?" And before Joseph could reply, he continued, "Then why would he choose to die? And on a cross? What kind of divinity is that?" He saw his execution squad returning and asked the men, "Did you break their legs?" "Yes," the centurion replied. "They're all dead now, but we didn't have to smash the prophet's legs. He had already died. Just to make sure, though, one of the men shoved a lance into his side. He was quite dead." "Tell me what happened, centurion." Still shaken from his afternoon at Golgotha, the officer gave Pilate a full briefing. He reported confiscating the prisoners' clothing, as was their legal right, then shaking dice for the prophet's seamless tunic, which the centurion won. Jesus asking his Father to forgive them, whoever them was, offering the crucified the usual drugged narcotic wine, but the prophet's refusal to take any. Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin waiting in vain for the man to recant so they could absolve him and let him die a blessed death. The strange conduct of the bandits, one mocking him, the other asking his blessing. Bystanders challenging him to use the touted supernatural powers to climb down the cross. The eerie darkness, Jesus' farewell messages to his mother and several followers who were there. The troops giving Jesus a little posca via saturated sponge on a reed, and then his death, and the frightening earthquake. "It almost seemed as if the gods were angry, Prefect," the centurion declared. "Whom did we crucify?" During the narration, Joseph of Arimathea was trying to attract Pilate's attention. Finally, he succeeded. "Oh, yes, counselor," Pilate turned to him. "Sorry to have kept you waiting. You may bury the body of Jesus." At the temple, meanwhile, the busiest afternoon of the year was concluding. Townspeople and pilgrims alike had converged on the sanctuary in order to have their Passover lambs slaughtered according to sacred ritual, and this had greatly reduced the crowd which might otherwise have thronged Golgotha to witness Jesus' crucifixion. Indeed, Caiaphas and members of the Sanhedrin had left Skull Place by 1:00 p.m. in order to conduct the Passover preparatory liturgy at the temple and supervise the sacrifice of lambs. The ceremonial had not gone well that afternoon. The sudden darkness frightened the worshippers, and the earthquake, while not causing any loss of life, had still terrified the people. The worst news was shielded from them. The large fissure from the quake had torn into the sacred curtains which screened off the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. The portent was so terrible that the priest did not try to interpret its significance, except for Rabbi Zadok, who resumed his intermittent 40-year fast for the safety of Jerusalem. However, since most worshippers were in the outer courts and did not see the damage, no panic resulted. The ritual now ended with a final sacrifice of 3 official lambs. Caiaphas, resplendent in his robes of office with gleaming breastplate and sacred ephod, presided over the ceremony, assisted by 3 Levites. The animals were unblemished specimens, and their throats were cut in a single stroke. There was no anguish bleeding, just the sound of a blood dripping into golden vessels. When enough was collected, the incarnadine was splashed onto a sacred stone. The victims were then flayed and the viscera carefully examined. In Rome, augurs would have determined, future tellers, the future for such probing. Here it was only to authenticate that the lambs had been in perfect health, for nothing less than flawless sacrifices were offered to God. The lambs proved physically impeccable, the ceremony successful, the people returned to their homes where the Seder was in final preparation. Procula felt well enough to join Pilate for dinner that evening, but her taciturnity cued him that she was informed of the day's events. Pilate was equally silent, not looking forward to the criticism from his wife that he fully expected. Procula, he finally ventured, why did you send that note out to the tribunal today? What sort of dream did you have? After she described her nightmare, Pilate laughed. But there is some truth to it. I was trying to free Jesus, and I was almost tempted to have Caiaphas crucified instead. Then the people really would have lynched me. Slowly she raised her eyes to his and transfixed him with a chilly stare. How does it feel, Pilate, to send an innocent man to his death? Immediately, abandoning his whimsy, he replied, It's not that simple, Procula. Was he guilty or innocent? She asked. Guilty as far as the Jews are concerned. And the Romans? She asked. Technically guilty of the charge of treason for calling himself King, Rex. Remember, king is one of the most despised terms in our language. We had 7 kings after Rome was founded, but that was enough. And what was the Senate going to debate on the Ides of March? Whether to confer the title of King or Rex on Caesar? It didn't happen. Even the emperors with power greater than any king never allow themselves to be called by that faithful title. Stop, Pilate. Was Jesus' kingship intended in any political sense? No. How could you condemn him then? Were you given a full report of the trial, Procula? The whole thing, my defense of Jesus throughout? Yes, she said. The centurion told me everything. You were doing so well, Pilate, acting nobly, in fact. I might even have forgiven you for ordering him scourged if I could be sure it was only to win sympathy from the people. It was, he replied. Then why did you fail? How did I fail? A touch of ire was seeping into his voice. Fail the cause of justice. You condemned a man you knew was innocent, the worst thing any judge can do. Freeing a guilty man is far more forgivable than what you've done. But you knew what was just and right. You knew what you should have done. She now had tears welling in her eyes, yet you didn't have the moral fiber to do it. I didn't know I married a man without a spine. Stop it, Procula, he thundered. I had to do it. Don't you understand? If I would have released Jesus, no, the crowd wouldn't have attacked me as your dream had it, but Jesus would likely have been lynched anyway once we left Jerusalem and our guard was removed. And if I hadn't given in, another riot would have broken out, shedding far more Jewish blood than that of one visionary prophet. Which would have been worse? Sometimes a little evil is necessary to bring about a greater good. You've opposed Jewish crowds on other occasions, she said, and you know the result. If the long shadow of Sejanus weren't touching us, I might have countered the crowd. But with Tiberius committed to his new pro-Jewish policy, it would have been insanity. Procula was silent for some moments, and then she said, What if it were true, Pilate? What if he were the Son of God? Are you serious? Yes. You always were the superstitious one, weren't you, Procula? Well, you may find it hard to believe, but even I gave a moment's thought to that possibility when I searched for a way to release him. Yet I reasoned that if in some fantastic unlikelihood I actually were judging divinity, the whole affair wouldn't get very far. Jesus would have waited for my judgment, then laughed at me and the screaming mob, and either struck us all down or simply walked away from the tribunal, and none of us could have done a thing about it. But the fact that he couldn't prevent his punishment proves that he was not, in fact, what he claimed to be. A true son of God, if such exists, wouldn't allow himself to be beaten, mocked, insulted. Therefore, when the scourging took place successfully, when the first drop of blood reddened his back, I knew we had a mere mortal on our hands, and that if crucified, the man would actually die. You see, Procula, no divinity could die. You make the logical error, she said, of assuming that what did happen had to happen. Because Jesus did not defend himself doesn't prove he could not defend himself. Perhaps he meant to suffer. Anyways, none of this excuses you from judicial murder. Watch your language, wife, he glared at her. Now we've established that this was no son of God. In fact, we established nothing of the sort, she said. All right, the one body qualified to judge such arcane matters, the Sanhedrin, decided that this was no son of God. Therefore, they condemned him as a false prophet and blasphemer. Now, even though I think it's barbaric to execute someone who uses his tongue the wrong way while involving their deity, this is their law, and Tiberius ordered me to uphold their law. What else could I do? When Procula did not respond, he pressed his case. 4 years ago, Jesus wouldn't have even come before my tribunal. The Sanhedrin still had jus gladi over Jewish nationals at the time. But under pressure from Sejanus, I withdrew their right to execute. Yet it was understood that I usually endorsed their verdict in capital cases. It was extraordinary on my part even to conduct a second hearing. Why did you do it then? She asked. Because I wanted to determine if the man were really guilty, also according to their law. This was a very rare situation, Procula, since they hardly ever see capital punishment. One rabbi told me the Sanhedrin, which issues a verdict of death more than once in 7 years, is a slaughterhouse. So you can see how important this case was to them. But the point is this. If Jesus' trial had been held 4 years ago, they would have simply stoned him to death without asking my permission. Doesn't it seem a rather strange argument, Pilate? I can crucify an innocent man because 4 years ago they would have stoned an innocent man. Pilate fumed. You keep calling him innocent. Remember, he was guilty in the eyes of the Jewish authorities. Should I blithely have disregarded Tiberius' order to respect their ancient and holy laws? Procula hesitated and then asked, was there no chance of sending him to a higher court or appealing to Caesar? No, he said, for 2 reasons. He made no appeal, and he couldn't have appealed since he wasn't a Roman citizen. But put the case that he had been. Tiberius still wouldn't have heard the appeal since he's not bothered with such affairs on Capri. Probably Marco, as Praetorian prefect, would have handled his appeal, and you know Macro. Procula said nothing for the next few minutes, and finally she asked, if you had to judge the case over again, would you give the same sentence? With only a moment's hesitation, Pilate replied, yes, of course, I would have had to. My hands were tied. I thought they were washed, Pilate. Enough! He bellowed. There simply was no other way. Would you have preferred a riot than an angry delegation to Tiberius? If in his present testy mood, he'd have listened only to their side of it, and I'd be recalled and disgraced, imprisoned, exiled, or invited to commit suicide, while you'd be stigmatized for the rest of your life. It was simply a choice between us and this man, Jesus. Can't you see that? Be honest now, Procula. Yes, she said, that's probably true. Well, he asked. Slowly and deliberately, she said, to have acquitted him anyway would have been a glorious demonstration of principle, an act of supreme altruism, which is giving to others. Supreme folly, he said. Saturday mornings were always quiet in Jerusalem, and this one was especially so. Except for the faithful attending worship, there was no activity in the city during that high and holy day, for this Sabbath was also the Passover. Pilate was doubly surprised then when a number of priests and leading Pharisees paid him a visit about mid-morning. Your Excellency, said Rabbi Helsius, we recall how that deceiver once said, while he was still alive, in 3 days I will rise again. Not that he will, of course. The temple treasurer smiled. But could you arrange to have his sepulchre guarded until the 3rd day? Otherwise his disciples may have come and steal the body. Then they would announce that he had risen from the dead, and this last fraud would be worse than the first. Pilate wanted no part of it. He had washed his hands of the case once and for all. You have your own guard. Take your temple police and make the tomb as secure as you can. He retorted, amazed at a fanaticism which could hound a man not only to his grave, but beyond it. The priest followed Pilate's advice, dispatching a detail from the temple guard to surround Joseph's tomb. They secured the precinct, sealed with stone, which had been rolled in front of the sepulchre, and remained on guard. The rest of Saturday lazily exhausted itself in a torpor, which, I don't know what that word is, which served as a welcome contrast to the previous day. It was an unusually warm Sabbath for so early in spring, but the evening was beautiful, as were all nights that week, shimmering in a silvery sea of moonlight. The Passover fell as the time of the first moon, on or after the vernal equinox. The fact of the full moon was still bothering Pilate. He was still somewhat intrigued by the atmospheric phenomenon which had blackened part of Friday afternoon. At first he had written off the unnatural darkness as a solar eclipse. Though hardly an astrologer, he now realized that when the moon was full, any eclipse of the sun was utterly impossible. The moon was in a diametrically wrong position. Pilate shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps Joseph of Arimathea was right. Nothing was normal that Friday. The end of chapter 19.